Hey there, folks. Welcome to another edition of Israel Explained. Today we're going to talk about an element of this war that you don't hear talked about much, and that is the internal displacement of refugees in Israel. You hear a lot more about the internal displacement of refugees among Palestinians, and we've talked about that in previous episodes, and perhaps rightfully so. There's definitely more of them, and they're living in worse conditions. But the Israeli displaced refugees are a political and strategic problem and an element of this war that isn't discussed enough. So, both for humanitarian reasons and for strategic reasons, it's time that we talked about this issue and how it's affecting the war. So there's never been this many internal refugees in Israel, at least not in the modern era. There have certainly been many occasions where Israelis have been displaced during war. During the Gulf War, for example, many people left Tel Aviv. Often people have left the north because of attacks from the north, from Hezbollah, with Katyusha missiles. Often people have left the south when there were barrages of missiles coming in from the Gaza Strip. But right now, there is a massive evacuation in the north and the south simultaneously. And in both cases, it's entire settlements and even cities that have been evacuated. So this is something the likes of which we haven't seen. So there's 14 settlements altogether. When I say settlements, I don't mean settlements in the West Bank sense. I mean villages, towns, kibbutzim, etc. And two cities. Those two cities are Sderot and Kiryat Shmona. Altogether, we're talking about 130,000 refugees, 70,000 of them from the south, 60,000 of them from the north. And they're currently staying in 225 hotels and other facilities throughout the country, mostly in the center of the country, where they're the safest. The zones they've been evacuated from are in proximity to the border. So if you live 7 kilometers from Gaza, your settlement has been evacuated. And if you live 5 kilometers from the border with Lebanon, your settlement has been evacuated as well. That means that a lot of places that have been under severe fire for many years, and at the beginning of this operation, on October 7th, there were even penetrations to the area, etc., like Ashkelon and Ashdod, are not included. Those are bigger cities. They're not considered to be in the same kind of immediate danger. It would cost a lot to evacuate them, so those cities have not been evacuated. That has caused some resentment among people there. There were programs to allow people in those cities to leave for a while and come back, but they haven't been fully evacuated. Now, the evacuations are not forced, they're voluntary. So people could stay behind. It's not illegal, but very few have. In the beginning, some people tried, but not only was it dangerous, also, their services weren't being provided there because the vast majority of the people have left. So very few have remained, and 130,000 people are displaced internally, a high number and a serious logistical problem. The government's made some efforts to provide them with services. So people are living in hotel rooms. They've received some vouchers, etc., for food. Uh, Also, the children have been provided with education. It took about a week or two in some cases, but they've all been hooked up through Zoom with laptops provided by the state, and their teachers, their regular teachers, teaching them by Zoom. I did see one teacher say in Channel 12 that the teaching conditions are not exactly optimal. She said, quote, "They have to see me yelling at my kids and arguing with my husband in my pajamas. Not ideal, somewhat overly intimate, but at least the education is proceeding." So this has been going on for 3 months now, and the people are getting very antsy about going back home. It's difficult to live with your family in one hotel room for 3 months. It's difficult to be away from your friends, your job, your um, schedule, your routine, all the things that make life livable. One individual I saw called it being a five-star hostage. He said, "We have both everything and we have nothing." Everything being they have shelter and their families, but they don't have their regular lives. But one very good side of this has been that the Israeli people have been happy to help the displaced people. They've been contributing, whether it's food or warm clothing or anything else that they need, which in some cases these people need badly. A lot of people living in these areas of the country, not all by any means, are on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. These are places where rent is generally cheaper and so forth. And a lot of them are living off their savings at this point. The sentiment that you always hear from people who have been displaced is the same, that they're willing to stay away, they're even happy to stay away, as long as when they come back, things are safe, that the threat has been removed. In Gaza, there's certainly been some progress towards the threat being removed, although the war there is very far from being won. In the north, those preliminary steps haven't even been taken. Some 160 Hezbollah members have been killed, more or less. Installations have been destroyed, but Hezbollah hasn't really been hurt. Their massive arsenal of rockets remains. Most of their terrorists remain intact. The tunnels haven't been touched, so that threat hasn't been removed at all. Just today, the government decided that they have a target date for the return of the refugees in the south. That's one of the reasons I'm doing this video. So on February 4th, they're hoping to bring everyone back to the south because fewer rockets are being launched at that area now. The threat of incursions has gone down significantly, and so forth. Meanwhile, in the north, there is no date because there's been no progress towards making the area safer. The negotiations with the United States over having Hezbollah move past the Litani, as per UN Resolution 1701, aren't going anywhere. The Israeli military operation isn't intense enough. I'm not even sure if it would work if it was intense enough. And Hezbollah is saying, and this is the most important part strategically, they won't stop shooting at Israel and making life impossible on the northern border until Israel starts shooting in Gaza, stops shooting in Gaza, until that conflict stops. This is the only leverage that Hezbollah has, but it's pretty strong leverage. They decided not to escalate. They decided not to enter into a full war. Hezbollah knows that the costs of that are higher than what they're willing to pay, especially in terms of internal Lebanese politics. But they are happy to continue this kind of war of attrition because the war of attrition is not harming them much. They're just losing some terrorists. But Israel is showing its inability to protect its own citizens. So, what does all this mean in terms of the costs that Israel is paying? Economics are increasingly an issue. One of the reasons that October 4th was picked as a date is because the finance ministry has been saying that the putting them up in hotels and giving them the services that they're currently giving them is draining the exchequer. The sums are not insignificant, but not that high. They're about 200 shekels per week, according to my calculation, and that's a little bit more than $50 million. It's like 54. Israel spent about $664 million on this so far. Every week that will increase. That's not chump change, but it's not a massive expense when you compare it to what Israel is spending on the war elsewhere in terms of ammunition, in terms of insurance for damaged buildings, and so on and so forth. So that's not the worst part of this. The worst part is it is a failure of the government to protect its citizens. And let's not be unfair and blame this on the Netanyahu government. The Israeli inability to deal with the Hezbollah threat to the north predates him. Netanyahu has been in charge for a long time, longer than any other prime minister, so he owns a lot of this. But none of the other prime ministers offered a solution to this either, because it's a very difficult problem to solve. Going into Lebanon to get rid of Hezbollah would have an incredible cost. So instead, Israel has found itself allowing its citizens to be vulnerable. And it's done the same thing in the South, where the costs of protecting the citizens were actually significantly lower. And of course, Netanyahu has more to do with that because, as we know, he allowed Hamas to base itself there and allowed funds to come in from Qatar. In Lebanon, he doesn't have that kind of direct issue. But in both cases, the government is being embarrassed by the fact that it can't protect its own borders and it can't protect its own people. Ultimately, the authority of any government is determined by its ability to defend its own citizens. And Israel has failed both in the north and in the south. And Hezbollah loves the fact that it can reveal the failure of the Israeli government and its weakness every single day without paying a heavy cost. Now, the return is scheduled for February 4th. Um, and that looks like what's going to happen. Sderot Mayor Alon Davidi, who's been mayor since 2013 and a outspoken advocate of a firm hand against Gaza, said that he won't have his people return unless there's a very firm plan for a direct response if any rockets fall on his city. And he also said he's not going to return if the people of northern Gaza are allowed to return to their homes. Right now, the lobby of the people in the Gaza envelope area, that's the areas inside Israel proper that are next to Gaza, is very strong. So their demands will be taken very seriously because the whole country is listening to them. But unfortunately, I have no doubt that as soon as the residents come back on February 4th, you will see a bunch of missiles shot at these cities and other settlements. Hamas holds back some of its capabilities for missile shooting in hiding for important moments, like on January 1st when they shot a bevy of rockets at Tel Aviv to make sure to remind Israelis that they're not safe on January 1st. Same thing's going to happen on February 4th in order to create those cracks between the civilians in the south and the government. The most important part to remember here is the leverage this gives Hezbollah. They're able to shoot rockets at will at any one of the northern settlements, and they say that they will continue to do so, make it impossible for Israelis to return until um, the fighting stops in Gaza. And that means there will continue to be dissatisfaction by Israeli citizens. The government will continue to be exposed in its inability to defend them, and they will continue to be a drain on the treasury. But that, of course, is not the main reason Israel has to eliminate the threat of Hezbollah, either diplomatically or militarily. It's in order to genuinely secure its citizens and to make sure that the North and the South aren't abandoned, which would be an incredible threat to Israeli sovereignty, authority, deterrence, and its reputation in the region. Okay, I only have one question, but it was a tough one. John Price asked, are there estimates about the loss of tanks and military vehicles so far between damaged and destroyed? Also, is it me, or are the casualties mostly in northern and central Gaza? Has the IDF implemented a more prudent approach in the south? Okay, let me start with the last part because it's a bit easier to answer. The casualties are indeed mostly in northern and central Gaza. There certainly have been ones in the south, and that is because the style of fighting there is completely different. Like you mentioned, Israel's being more prudent, less high intensity, but also it's not fighting in the entire city. It's fighting in certain areas, and in those areas, there's a lot of soldiers, and those soldiers are backing each other up and driving Hamas operatives or terrorists underground. Um, you can't really have soldiers spread that thinly, have that large a concentration of soldiers elsewhere. So the fighting there is different, um, and we're seeing less casualties. So it's less area, more focused on tunnels, more soldiers to cover each other, and that's why we're seeing less casualties. You're absolutely correct. As for the loss of tanks and military vehicles, that is a matter of extreme contention. The main reason being the IDF hasn't released figures, and the Palestinians have released many made-up figures, sometimes in the hundreds of Israeli tanks, which of course makes absolutely no sense because hundreds of tanks is what you lose in a major armored battle, not what you lose in the occasional skirmish against people with rocket-propelled grenades. But there certainly have been losses of tanks. I've tried to figure out how many tanks by looking at verified reports. I'm seeing about 16 tanks were either destroyed or damaged at various points in this conflict. I don't know how many of them were um, able to be repaired. My guess is most of them, but I'm sure about three or four have been total losses, and 30 something APCs. That's what I've been able to gather from reliable sources. If I'm wrong, and I'm probably wrong by a little bit, it's something in that ballpark. It's definitely not all the hundreds that we're hearing about. But the truth is, the Hamas anti-tank missiles have been more effective against Merkava tanks than we expected them to be. And part of that is because Hamas has spent a lot of time and effort trying to figure out what the weaknesses of the Merkava tank are, the optimal spots to hit. So when you just hit the tank wherever, chances are the tank will be okay, but they're trying to aim at certain weak spots, and when they hit that, that's when the trouble starts. And of course, some of the worst losses of tanks were on October 7th when the tanks were surrounded and they could be hit from any angle that Hamas wanted. Okay, so that's it for this episode. If you like what I do here, consider supporting me on Patreon at Shael Media. Consider listening to my podcast, History of the Land of Israel podcast, and I will hopefully see you here